Okay, so I believe everybody should be entering in the webinar now, if my tech is working correctly. So welcome everybody to Creating Safe Spaces. This is a webinar in celebration of Pride Month. So quick intro, I'm Rosie. I'm community manager at the Happiness Index, and we are celebrating this Pride Month with this webinar. And for those of you who don't know the history of Pride Month, it's celebrated to recognize the Stonewall riots that happened in 1969 in New York. And it was an uprising in response to police harassment and brutality. And since then, the movement of fighting for justice and equality in the LGBTQ plus community has made some progress, but there is still work to do. So that's the purpose of having this webinar today. And at the Happiness Index, we've done a few webinars, especially throughout the past year, focusing on diversity and inclusion. But we realized we haven't really touched on this space yet. So I was introduced to Katie through our Happiness and Humans community about 6 months ago. Was it Katie? Around
It
then?
was, yeah, it was Rosie, yeah.
Yeah, so she shared her story with me, and really excited for Katie to share her story with everybody else in this webinar today. And Margot has been working with our team at the Happiness Index for the past year, I think, when she used to work with Sodexo. And she's done a lot of work in creating safe spaces within organizations. So I'm going to stop rambling and hand it over to Katie and Margot to do a quick introduction of themselves, and then we'll get into their presentations. So Margot, if you'd like to start off, and then Katie, we can go over to you, and then you can start off with your presentation.
Okay.
Sure. Thanks so much, Rosie. And listen, just make it quick. Firstly, it's great to be here. Really important in Pride Month to be visible and to be seen. And when we can't do things in person, then this is absolutely the next best way of making that happen. So thank you for creating the space for us to do this. It's great to be here with Katie and to have the opportunity to support the trans community as well and to have this conversation. I think conversations and using our voice are very important. So quickly about myself, as Rosie said, Margot Slattery, and I head up global diversity and inclusion for ISS. I used to work for Sodexo about a month and a half now into my new role with ISS. And I'll tell a little bit about when I do my session about my own personal background. But, you know, for me right now, it's about making people aware about why Pride is so important as an element of diversity and inclusion, and how we incorporate it and inclusive spaces and conversations into what we do every day. So I look forward to the conversation and look forward to hearing and sharing my story, but most importantly, hearing Katie's and the discussion afterwards. Thanks, and over to you, Katie.
Brilliant. Thanks, Margot, and thanks, Rosie, as well. Yeah, so I'm Katie Neeves, and I run a business called Cool to be Trans. And basically, I'm just a gobby trans woman. So I'm going to tell you my story in a minute. So there's no point in me rambling on too much about that. So what I want to do is just run through what's going to be happening over the next sort of hour and a half or so. So first of all, I'm going to tell you my story, the story of my long walk to womanhood. I'm then going to give you some top tips for being a trans ally. Then I'm going to hand over to Margot. Margot's going to tell you how to create safe and inclusive spaces within the workplace. And then we're going to do a Q&A for both of us. And during that Q&A, you can ask us absolutely anything. Well, I haven't asked Margot that. I'm assuming that's okay with Margot. It's okay with me anyway. You can ask me absolutely anything. This is your safe space to ask anything, no holds barred. So I'd like to tell you my story in the hope, well, first of all, it's not a particularly unusual story, and not a particularly unusual journey, but it's a story that many people feel unable to tell for fear of being ridiculed or even abused. But as I'm such a big show off, I'm going to tell it to you anyway. So you can probably tell from the low pitch of my voice that either I've been a heavy smoker for the last 30 years, or in fact, I am transgender. Well, frankly, I couldn't cope with the sheer stigma of being labelled as a smoker, so I decided to go for the easier option. However, being trans isn't easy, and it's definitely not optional. So yes, I used to be a bloke. I have pretty awful dress sense too, but that's another story. So I'd like to tell my story in the hope that it inspires you to be whoever you want to be in life, but also in the hope that it equips you to support and understand any trans people that you come across in your life, whether it's in your friendship circle, in your family, or even at work. Because it's not an easy journey, and we need all the support we can get, frankly. So I was born 52 years ago, and as is still the established custom, I was assigned a sex based purely on my physical sex characteristics, i.e. what was between my legs. I was assigned male at birth, and I was given the name Martin Albert Neeves. So that was me, labelled. However, at the age of around 3 or 4, my head and my heart were telling me something very different to the label that I'd been given at birth. And one of my earliest memories was age of around 3 or 4, was of my mum catching me trying on a pair of my sister's knickers. And I remember when I tried them on, it felt so right. I felt right. But then my mum came in and she told me off. She told me to take them off. And for every day of the following week, she would pull my shorts down to check that I was wearing my own pants. And it was humiliating, but it sowed the seeds for a very long time that what I was doing was wrong. It was dirty. It was naughty. It was not what respectable people did. But however much my mum told me off about it, the urge and the need to cross-dress as it was then would always be with me. Now, I had a happy childhood, apart from the lifelong trauma caused by my mum cutting my hair like that on the day the school photographer came. I don't know what she was thinking about. I think the pudding basin must have slipped. Mind you, it was the early 70s, and I think a lot of people had haircuts like that then. But she thought it was acceptable anyway. She must have been on the gin that day. She doesn't even drink. But I was mostly happy as a boy, although I had more friends who were girls than were boys. And I was never into football or any sport for that matter, preferring to have music and photography as my main hobbies. And throughout my childhood, I always used to secretly dress in my sister's clothes whenever I had the opportunity. And whenever I did it, it felt so right. But then those feelings of feeling right were very quickly overtaken by feelings of shame and guilt and self-loathing. So every time I did it, I would promise myself that I would never, ever do it again. And I tried so hard not to do it. I really did. And every time I tried, it would last for a while, but then the urge and the need to cross-dress would always come back, and usually with a vengeance. And it was many years before I'd even admit to myself that then I was a cross-dresser. I was just in self-denial for a long time. So this vicious cycle went on for many years, and right up until my mid-20s. So by then I'd trained to become a press photographer, and I was initially working on newspapers in Kent, in the southeast of the UK. And after doing that, I left and moved up to the Midlands in the UK, and I got a job as a senior staff photographer with the Coventry Evening Telegraph. Stayed there for 5 years before leaving to set up my own freelance photography and video business, which I called Martin Neeves Photography and Film. Can you see the problem that caused me later on in life? Here's a tip: if you're ever going to start a business, don't call it after your own name, especially if you're trans. So by my mid-20s, I got a successful business and I got married for the first time. And it was only in my mid-20s that I finally accepted and embraced the fact that then I was a cross-dresser. And as soon as I did that, I no longer felt guilty about it. It was like a whole weight lifting off my shoulders. And I realized that I had a condition called gender dysphoria. And what that is, it's a great feeling of unease and distress caused by a mismatch between how I felt in my head and my heart, i.e. my gender identity, as opposed to my primary physical sex characteristics and the label that I've been given at birth. And the thing about gender dysphoria, it can vary in intensity, and it very often increases over time. And that's exactly what happened with me, and I wasn't prepared for it at all. I really wasn't. But at the time, the level of gender dysphoria that I had was low enough that it was satisfied by my occasional cross-dressing. So at the time, I was happy as a man who needed to cross-dress, and that was all it was. So I thought. But I never in a million years thought that I would ever need to transition. I really didn't. Now, my first marriage lasted for 13 years, and during that time, my business flourished and my photos were regularly published in national newspapers and magazines. And I photographed many notable people and events, such as the 1990 poll tax riots in Trafalgar Square, Princess Diana's funeral, the Yugoslav Civil War in Croatia, and I was twice commissioned to photograph the Queen inside Buckingham Palace. So I really had built up a great reputation for myself, you know, and a lot of experience in that time. But say my first marriage lasted for 13 years, although we should have split sooner because my first wife never accepted my cross-dressing as it was then. But I mean, we had tried counselling many times, but it only papered over the cracks. It never solved the problem. But there was another issue in that I wanted kids and she didn't, and it was less important to me when I was younger. But as I was approaching 40, the urge to be a dad was growing, and it was just so much stronger. And so I just felt that I needed to do something about it. And so I instigated the first divorce. And it was a shame because we loved each other and we were a great team together, apart from those two big things that we couldn't get past. But during my first divorce, I then went on to meet a woman who would eventually become my second wife. And I decided to tell her about my cross-dressing on our second date. Thought the first date was probably pushing it. You know, hello, do you come here often? Oh, look, we've got matching knickers. It doesn't really work, does it? I wouldn't see her for dust. But to my surprise and to my delight, she was okay with it. But there were conditions attached. She said, as long as I didn't do it more than once a week. In those days, I didn't, because the level of gender dysphoria that I had was low enough that it was satisfied by just doing it about once a week. And so that was okay. That was a tick in the box. That was fine. And then she said, as long as I never want to transition. Well, I categorically didn't want to transition. I was happy as a man who needed to cross-dress at the time. So that was another tick in the box. But then there was another one she said that I didn't really agree to, but she said, if if ever we had kids, she didn't want them seeing the cross-dressing, and I didn't really agree to that because I'd already lived a double life within my first marriage, and I didn't really want to do that with any kids, and I didn't want there to be some big reveal at age 18 or however old she thought was old enough, and then to think any child think that they didn't know who their dad was. But I thought, well, let's face it, I'm fishing from a smaller pond here. And 2 out of 3 isn't bad. Let's face the third one if and when that happens. So our relationship blossomed, and 10 years ago we had a beautiful baby daughter who was the absolute center of my universe. I'll tell you what, she doesn't look like that now. I suppose that does make 2 of us, though, doesn't it? She didn't have an attitude then either. Anybody who's a parent to a 10-year-old will know what I'm talking about. But it was many years before we got around to getting married, because after going through the pain and the cost of the first divorce, I always said I'd never get married again. But eventually I weakened and I proposed, and we got married in August 2017. I should point out that's my mum there, that's not the bride. So we got married. But however, a few months before we got married, I just happened to meet a spiritual guide and clairvoyant at a business networking meeting. Now, I can't see any of you at this stage, so I'm hoping you're all still there. But yeah, you have my full permission to have your eyebrows fully raised at this point. I'm assuming that you all have. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever been to any business networking meetings, but you tend not to meet people like clairvoyants at those sort of things. You meet lots of people like accountants and financial advisors, and nothing wrong with those people at all. I've got lots of my friends with those sort of people. But clairvoyants are so interesting to talk to. And I was so fascinated by her. I was talking to her for most of the evening. And I was so intrigued by her that I decided to book up for a reading. Now, I didn't feel the need for a reading, but I was just intrigued. Anyway, I went along, and she blew me away. She was incredible. She said so many things that were so true, so pinpoint accurate, things that she couldn't have guessed and she couldn't have found out from my website or my social media. But then she said lots of other things that just didn't make sense at the time. Now, they make perfect sense now, but they didn't at the time. She said things like, there's a new way of being, and there's an issue that you've always known about, but that you're not fully in integrity with. And she said, Spirit want you to go off for a long walk in the countryside, talk to yourself, talk to nature, and talk to Spirit, and they will show you what you need to see. So I thought, okay, well, I like walking. What the hell? Yeah. But I was really busy at the time. I was busy with my work, and it was the run up to our wedding, so there was loads of stuff going on. I just didn't have the time to take myself off for a day to do a long walk. So in the meantime, we got married in the August 2017. And it wasn't until very early November 2017 that I finally found the time to take myself off to Rutland Water, which is in the Midlands. It's a beautiful part of the country. It's a huge, great big reservoir. And I worked out this really long route around the southern countryside and came back along the south shore. And I went midweek because I didn't want to meet anybody else because it's always busy at the weekends. And I remember it now. It was a beautiful day. It was a blue sky. The sun was shining. It was a very cold, crisp, clear day. And I went off with my map and my compass and my walking boots and my backpack. And I was on a mission. I was striding out and I was talking to myself, talking to nature, talking to spirit, whoever they were. It's funny, my cat has just come to join me. That's why I'm doing this. I'm just trying to settle him down. He usually comes to upstage me doing these things. Anyway, I remember feeling disappointed at the time because I was naively expecting some sort of light bulb moment, or some sort of big voice as if to say, "This is what you should be seeing." Strangely, that didn't happen. I can't imagine why. But strangely, about the same sort of time, my gender dysphoria went through the roof. Now, I don't know whether it was a coincidence or not. I really don't know, but it happened. It went through the roof, so much so that I just didn't know what gender I was at all. I just hadn't got a clue. I was in complete turmoil over this, and I was in so much turmoil that I was even typing into Google, "What gender is Martin Neeves?" Now, I know that's crazy because the answer could only come from me. It couldn't come from anybody else, particularly Google. But I was desperate, and it's what desperate people do. Now, I couldn't tell my wife about my inner turmoil because I didn't want to stir up a hornet's nest unnecessarily if it turned out to be something of nothing. But then, if I did tell her, it would lead to her asking me questions, which at the time, I just didn't have the answers to. I just didn't know what gender I was at all. So I just had to face this on my own. So the first thing I did was to get some counselling, and I found a counsellor who had experience of dealing with people with gender issues. And I had 4 sessions with her, and in hindsight, I think I should have had more sessions because at the end of those sessions, I wrongly concluded that I was gender fluid. And I realise now why I came to that conclusion, and that was my fear of admitting to myself that I was a transgender woman that was making me hang on to any bit of masculinity that I had, and that was an easy way of doing it, or easy-ish way of doing it. But anyway, I didn't just take that conclusion as read. While I was doing that, I was working my way through a self-help workbook called You and Your Gender Identity by a gender therapist from the States called Dara Hoffman Fox. It's a brilliant book. It's like psychotherapy in a book. It's great. And there's a lot of work involved, though. It took me about 2 months to work my way through it. And by the time I got to about 3/4 of the way through the book, it became obvious that I wasn't gender fluid. I was, in fact, a transgender woman. In fact, I just realized I haven't actually explained what gender fluidity is, and some of you may be familiar with the term. I ought to just go back and just explain what that is. So gender fluidity. So let's look at sex and gender overall to begin with. So sex. So when we're all just born as babies, surprise, surprise. But we're born with various bits between our legs, bits inside our bodies, bits in our heads, between our ears, bits on the ends of our arms and our legs, bits everywhere. But the only bits that count for the birth certificate are the bits between our legs. And certainly in the UK, the choice that the doctor or midwife has of putting down, when they sex the baby, is either boy or girl. That's all they have. They have this binary choice, boy or girl. But the thing about that is that sex isn't binary. Nature is very messy. It doesn't do black and white like that. It's very messy. And so many people have got an extra chromosome, so they're intersex. It's about 2% of the population, which is quite significant, to be honest. And so they can have the primary sex characteristics of both sexes. And so for instance, they could have a vagina, but they could have internal testes. But obviously, at birth, the internal testes can't be seen, and so it's only the vaginas that's seen. So obviously, they'd be put down as a girl. So that's for an example. But that's just talking about sex. At the time of birth, there is no way of telling what the gender of a baby is. So these gender reveal parties that some people have are ridiculous. They're not gender reveal parties. They're just talking about sex, and they're just my baby has or hasn't got a willy party, basically. That's all they are. So that's sex. So let's look at gender. So gender is about how you feel in your head and your heart. It's how you just know, who you are. You don't need to look at your genitalia to know what gender you are. But gender, just the same as sex, isn't binary. There's a whole spectrum, and it's not linear either. So many people are what's called agender, so they don't have a gender at all. And but just for simplicity purposes, for the time being, just think of it as linear. Think of it as 100% male at one end, 100% female at the other end. Nobody's 100% of either. We're all somewhere on the spectrum somewhere. But most cisgender people, so that's non-trans people, have never had to look at where they are on that spectrum, because their gender has never caused them any issues. Their gender matches their sex, their sex and the sex they've been assigned at birth, and their physical sex characteristics, and so they just accept what was put in on their birth certificate. But for about 1% of the population, like me, our gender has caused us issues, and there is a mismatch between how we feel in our head and our heart as opposed to our primary physical sex characteristics. And so we've had to look at where we are on the spectrum. So when you look at the spectrum, the people that are roughly in the middle of the spectrum, they're non-binary, and so they don't feel either male or female. And for gender fluid people, they're roughly in the middle, but sometimes they feel male and sometimes they feel female. And so, all these things are perfectly normal, perfectly natural ways of being a human being. There's nothing wrong with the human beings. There's an awful lot wrong with the labeling system that we're forced to adopt. So anyway, that's a brief sort of explanation of sex and gender. So at the time of, say, the counselling, I thought that I was gender fluid, but then, as I say, I was going through this workbook, and by the time I got to about 3/4 of the way through the book, it became obvious that I wasn't gender fluid, and that I was in fact a transgender woman. And by the time I got to the end of that book, that conclusion hadn't changed. So now I had two conclusions, but they were different. So I thought, what can I do now? So I thought, I know, I'll send a text back to the clairvoyant to see if she can shed any light on this. I just desperate to know. So I sent a text back to her, and she sent a text back saying, "That's funny, I was expecting your text." No, she didn't. That was just a cheap joke. I couldn't resist myself. Sorry. So anyway, I should point out this day, she's not just some sort of mystic Meg sitting in a caravan predicting the lottery numbers. Although, to be honest, with the state of my finances at the moment, that would be quite handy. So if anybody knows anybody like that, please put it in the chat. I would point out I've asked many audiences the same question over the years, and so to date, not one of them has come up with a phone number like that. So no pressure or anything. I do have high expectations, though. But no, she is. She's a spiritual guide specialising in clairvoyant healing, and she's a healer member of the National Federation of Spiritual Healers, which is recognised by the NHS in England. So she's got some credibility about her. And she suggested that I go to her for what's called a Vision Quest session. And what that is a 4-hour interactive process. And during that, she uses techniques such as deep meditation to get you into a really relaxed state and to allow you to get past all your fears, and so you can access your inner truth. And so I went along for that session on the 11th of January 2018. It's a date I'll never forget. And during that session, she didn't give me any answers at all. She just asked me a series of questions. It was question after question after question. It was relentless. It really was. And she allowed all the answers to come from me and from my inner truth. And it was such an emotional session. I cried buckets that day. I really did. And it was at the end of that session that I admitted to myself that I am a transgender woman and that I need to change my body. And that was the point that I really felt female. And I felt that Martin had stepped back and Katie had taken over. And it felt so right then, and it's felt so right ever since. So now, after all 3 different approaches, I had discovered my true gender identity. So what now? What was I going to do with this new piece of information? I had a happy home life. I had a successful business. Could I put all of that in jeopardy just for this new piece of information? On the other hand, could I go back to living how I was before with this new piece of information eating away at me? I didn't think I could. And the trouble is, once you know your true gender identity, you can't unknow it. You know, that particular genie just wasn't going back in the bottle. It really wasn't. I didn't want to be trans. No one does, as it invariably involves a lot of loss, pain, and heartache, as well as having to deal with prejudice and bigotry along the way. No one chooses to be trans. The only choice I had was whether I did something about it or not, and decided to transition. And the research that I did showed that most people who decide to transition after the initial loss, pain, and heartache and bumpy journey along the way, usually go on to lead happy and contented lives, whereas many people who decide not to transition, sadly, they often end up in a spiral of depression or often worse. And so the urge to live my truth was just so overwhelmingly strong because I was finally at peace with myself. I knew who I was, you know, so I just had to face this head on. So the first challenge I had was to tell my wife about this, and that was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. No, that was the second hardest thing. The first hardest thing that I've had to do was actually admit to myself that I was trans. That was definitely the hardest thing. The next hardest thing was to tell my wife. And I was so frightened of telling her that it took me a whole month to pluck up courage to tell her. And I was so frightened that I wrote her a letter just in case my words didn't come out right. In the end, my words did come out right, but I gave her the letter at the end anyway, so she had something to refer to, because she was in such complete shock. It was such a bombshell that I dropped on her, and I felt terrible for doing it. I really did. And suffice to say, the news went down as badly as you'd expect. And I should point out that sexuality and gender are completely separate entities, and they're not linked. So in my case, I've always been attracted to women, and I still am. It's been one of the constants in my life. It's just that the labels changed. So previously I was labeled as a heterosexual man. Now I'm labeled as a lesbian. Feels no different to me. I'm just attracted to women. That's all it is. Yeah? But obviously for my wife, her label hadn't changed. She was still attracted to men. So there was a problem. There was a mismatch. We tried counselling, but unfortunately that didn't work. So unfortunately that meant the end of my second marriage. So even though we'd been together for a long time, that was a very short marriage. So the next dilemma I had was what to do about the name of my photography and video business when I changed my name to Katie. Now, I could have changed the name to Katie Neeves Photography and Film. But the problem is that by that stage it had been an established brand for 22 years. And I was and still am actually ranked second in the UK on Free Index of photographers purely from customer reviews. So I built up a great reputation and a great name for myself. And I just felt that the brand name was too strong to change. And so I just felt that I had to keep the name of the business the same, but detach myself from it, even though I'm the only person working in the business. So instead of being Martin from Martin Neeves Photography and Film, I'd be Katie from Martin Neeves Photography and Film. And so what I decided to do was come out very openly and very honestly and very publicly as being trans and continue to do that. So it was a big decision to make. So what I decided to do was to make a coming out video. And what I'd like to do is share with you that first minute of the coming out video now. So I think Rosie has got that queued up ready. So when you're ready, Rosie, if you can hit play, please, that would be great.
Okay, I should. Are you able to see my screen, Katie?
Yes, I can see that now.
Okay.
Hi there. I expect you're wondering what the hell I'm doing in front of the camera instead of behind the camera. I'm beginning to wonder that myself, actually. But I've got some big changes coming up, and I wanted to tell you about it, and I thought video was the best way of doing it. Basically, over the last few months, or since about October last year, I've been in complete turmoil in my personal life. Basically, I've just admitted to myself and accepted that I'm actually a transgender woman, and that I need to change my body. So commonly what most people call as a sex change. Sorry if that's a real shock to you. It's a shock to me as well. But here's a bit of background.
Thanks, Rosie. So if you want, that's only just the first minute of it. If you'd like to see the whole video, it lasts for about 10 minutes. If you go onto my website, which is cooltobetrans.co.uk, and go onto the About Me page, it's the video. There's two videos on that. It's the one at the bottom. So yeah, please have a look at that. So on the 26th of April 2018, I decided to make that video public. I sent it to all my clients and I put it on all my social media. Go big or go home. And I remember now my finger nervously hovering over the mouse, knowing that as soon as I make that click to make the video live, my life would never be the same again. Anyway, I clicked the mouse and I waited. But then I had to go out on a job. But my mind wasn't on the job. I took the photos as quickly as I could. The client was very happy with the pictures, but I couldn't wait to get back to see what was happening on Facebook, because Facebook was the first one. I was so worried because I didn't have any long-term contracts, and I didn't work for a big company as a staff photographer or anything, so I wasn't protected by any anti-discrimination laws. If my clients had an issue with me being trans, then the phone would stop ringing and I'd lose all my clients, I'd lose my income, lose my reputation. Everything rested on the reaction to that one video. I was so worried about it. Anyway, I got back, and I needn't have worried because I was inundated with literally hundreds of messages of support. It was amazing. I felt so loved. I didn't do any work for 3 whole days because I was so busy replying to all these lovely messages of support. It was incredible. And as well as getting messages of support from friends and from clients, I had other messages from other trans people who'd seen it and said that they'd been struggling with their gender, and they thanked me for what I said because they said it had helped them. And it went from being something that I was absolutely dreading, I was really dreading coming out, to being one of the most uplifting experiences of my life. It was right up there with the birth of my daughter. Really was second only to that. Amazing. So that was me, well and truly outed. But there was one particular message that really stood out to me and really struck a chord with me. And that was from a woman whose son had had gender issues when he was going through puberty. And she told me that she was worried at the time that he'd either be bullied, or he'd self-harm, or he'd attempt suicide. And she was right to be worried, as Stonewall's Trans Mental Health Survey of 2012 shows that 48% of trans people in the UK have attempted suicide at least once, and 84% have thought about it. And she said to me, she said, if only there was someone like you out there at the time to let him know that it's okay to be trans, because it is okay to be trans. And that really got me thinking. And I thought, I've really got to do some good with this. I've got to, I thought I'd vlog my whole journey, bring people along on the journey with me, make it accessible, reach out to other trans people to show them that it is okay to be trans, and also educate everybody else and show them that trans people are just ordinary people who want to be happy, just like everyone else. And that's it. That is the entire message. And so I started doing that, and then my message was picked up initially in the local media, and I started doing interviews for local radio and local newspapers, and then it escalated, and I started doing stuff for national radio and television and national newspapers and magazines. And so all of a sudden I'd become this sort of trans ambassador, if you like. And I think that a lot of prejudice and bigotry comes from a fear of the unknown. So if you can take that unknown away, then you're doing a really good thing. So I think education is the key here. So the more education there is, the more acceptance there will be. And then the more acceptance there will be, the easier it will be for other trans people to A, admit to themselves they're trans, because that's the hardest thing, it really is. And then B, actually do something about it and live their best life. As ultimately, that's what we all want to do, whether we're trans or not. We all want to live our best life, don't we? Now, with waiting times to get seen at NHS gender clinics in the UK, just to get a first appointment at a gender clinic after we've been referred from our GP, of anything between 3 and 5.5 years, that is years, that's not months, that is years, I felt that I couldn't wait that long, because it was like a pressure cooker building up over 48 years for me. All of a sudden, built up, and all of a sudden, boom, it was out there. I'd admitted to myself, this is who I am, this is what I'm going to do, and I just wanted to crack on with it. I just felt I couldn't wait that long. But I was in the fortunate enough position, I was able to afford to pay to go to a private gender clinic. And so I started paying, but there were even long waiting lists. You can wait for a year to be seen at a private gender clinic. But I was very lucky that I managed to get cancellation appointments. So I got seen very quickly. And so because of that, I've been on hormone therapy now for just over 3 years. I changed my name to Katie in July 2018. And I've been living full time as female for about two years, 7 months, something like that. And it's been such a whirlwind in that time, but it feels so right. And it's, there hasn't been a single day that I've got up in the morning and thought, oh, I'll pretend to be Martin again today. Not a single day. It really hasn't. And even though I've got a different name and a different appearance, I'm still exactly the same person on the inside that I've always been. I've got the same skills, the same experience, the same sense of integrity, the same sense of humor. However warped, I'm still exactly the same person, but far, far happier. I also have cravings for chocolate now too, but it's a girl thing. So I then went on to form Cool to be Trans, to do trans awareness training and inspirational speaking and media appearances to make trans education accessible, but also to support other trans people. Because I'm getting reasonably high profile now, I get contacted by lots of trans people and just in need of a bit of support, and often they might be in a state of self-denial, or they might have just admitted it to themselves, but then be really frightened of the path ahead and think that the world is going to collapse around them. But I'm there to tell them that it's not. My world has expanded enormously. It's been incredible, and I'm so excited about this. And I never thought that so many positive things would have come out of that very emotional meeting that I had with the clairvoyant on the 11th of January 2018. Now, fear often stops people from doing things that they really should do for their highest well-being, and it could have easily have stopped me from A, admitting to myself that I was trans, and B, from doing something about it. But I found that reality is usually a lot easier than you fear. And one of my biggest surprises in all of this is that the vast majority of people are supportive. They really are. They're very supportive. Okay, they often use clumsy language, but that's okay. I can help them with that. I can, I can. That's an education piece. I can help them with that. But most people are supportive. Another big surprise is that white van drivers stop to let me cross the road now. Now that never used to happen, but when they do that, I just put my hand up and I say in my deepest voice, "Thanks, mate." Yeah, that really shocks them. You want to see their faces? Terrible. So my biggest piece of advice to you is, if you're planning on doing something big in your personal life or with work or anything, and you're worried about it, just accept that fear, because that's to be human, is to be fearful of big change. Just accept, not acknowledge that fear, but go for it anyway. Because most people regret the things in life that they didn't do, not the things they did do. So that's my story so far. So I'd now like to go on to telling you my top tips for being a trans ally. So if a friend or family member comes out to you, or even work colleague comes out to you as being trans, firstly treat it as a compliment, because it shows that they trust you enough with such sensitive and personal information. And it would have invariably come from after years of self-loathing and self-denial before they get to that stage where they can admit it to themselves or tell someone else. So the first thing is to do is to show your empathy and support, and acknowledge that you appreciate how hard it was for them, and continue to do that, because it's a tough journey and they're going to need your support. And then when they have told you, never out them to a third party, because it should be their information to give. They should be in control of who they tell and when, because coming out generally is a very gradual process. I know mine was pretty extreme, but I did tell a very close circle of friends before I did my big coming out video. So generally people tell a very close circle of friends first, and then they tell a few more people and a few more people, until they get to the outer reaches, when they're telling people who definitely won't get it. But by then it doesn't matter, because they've already got their support network all around them. So that's generally how it works. So if you do out someone before they're ready, not only are you breaching their privacy, you could be putting their personal safety at risk. So it's very important. And never confuse gender with sexuality. So as I've already outlined before, who you are has got nothing to do with who you're attracted to. They're two completely separate things, and they're not linked. That's it. Quite simple. Pronouns can be quite tricky, because especially if you've known someone as he, him, or she, her for many years, and then all of a sudden you're asked to use she, her, or he, him, or they, them, or any of the other ones, it can be difficult to get used to using new names. But please try, because it feels amazing as a trans person or a non-binary person to be validated by that, because it shows that people accept you for who you really are. And conversely, when you're misgendered and people use the wrong pronouns, it really hurts. And I liken it to being jabbed with a knitting needle. It's only a knitting needle, but so once or twice isn't going to hurt. But if that's done a lot continually over and over again, that really hurts. It really does. So please try. And if you're not sure which pronouns to use, just ask. Most trans people like being asked what pronouns to use, because it shows that you care and that you've got a willingness to get it right. It really does. And if you get it wrong, don't beat yourself up about it. Just apologize and move on, because as gender non-conforming people, we know who is supportive and who's not. And if someone who is supportive slips up and they call me he or him or Martin just because they've known me for years and they've just slipped up, it doesn't bother me at all, because I know that they are supportive and it's just a slip of the tongue. It's okay. So I'm not going to castigate them for that. But if somebody does it continually and deliberately, then that's different. That's abuse, and I won't tolerate that. And the language is very important. So when you're talking about somebody who's not trans, please try to avoid using words like real, biological, genetic, or my personal favorite, normal, because that implies that trans people aren't real, biological, genetic, or normal. Well, certainly on the last count, I was all 4 of those. Well, 3 out of 4 isn't bad. It's much better to use the word cisgender or cis. So cisgender man, cis woman, that's how it's used. And that's a word that most people have never heard of. And so if you use that word and somebody says, well, what does that mean? It's great. It's your chance to educate them. It's a good opportunity, isn't it? And then try to avoid using words like transgendered or transgendering, because it's impossible to be transgendered or transgendering, just as it's impossible to be gayed or to be gaying. We are transgender, or trans for short, and we are transitioning, or in transition. And then when you're referring to a group of trans people, please don't use the word transgenders. We're not a condition. We are people. We are transgender people, or just trans people. And then when you're talking about trans people, please don't say that they were born a boy or born a girl, because as I said earlier, we're just born as babies with various bits, and the label that we're given at birth is given to us. We're not born with that label. We are assigned male or female at birth. So it's much better to acknowledge that and say that, and say that we are assigned male or female at birth. And that's actually a mistake that I made on my coming out video. I actually said I was born a boy, but that was purely, that showed the level of my education on the issue at the time. So we're all on a learning journey with this. Okay, dead name. Now, I'm quite unusual in the trans world that I'm very comfortable talking about my old name. I'm completely at peace with my past. I have fond thoughts towards Martin. Martin will always be a part of me, and I'm grateful for Martin for stepping back and allowing me to be Katie. So I'm very happy talking about Martin. I don't like being called Martin because it's not my name anymore, but I'm completely comfortable talking about Martin. However, I'm quite unusual in that respect, because most trans people don't even like the mention of their old name, let alone being called their old name. So, and so much so that they call it their dead name. And I think it's quite sad that they do, but that's generally how it is. So please try to avoid using people's old name, because it may well trigger their gender dysphoria. And if somebody comes out to you as being trans and they do actually tell you their old name, again, treat it with confidence, because it's not your information to pass on. Now, this is one that just happens all the time. So often, the first thing that people ask me after I've come out to them as being trans, the first thing they ask me is about my genitalia and about lower surgery. Well, you wouldn't ask cisgender people about their genitalia or that surgery when you first meet them. So why ask a trans person? I mean, I think you'd at least need to buy them a very large gin and tonic first, wouldn't you? You'd have to know them really well. But even then, with your closest friends, you wouldn't generally ask about that sort of thing unless they brought up the subject first. The trans people are no different. Some trans people might want to tell you about operations and their genitalia and stuff like that, and if they do, then that's fine. But let them lead the way on that. That's all there is to it. And I don't think people ask the question out of malice. I think it's just a lack of education, and I think so many people think that transition is just all about lower surgery, but it's not. There are very, very many steps along the way to transition, and lower surgery is only one of those steps. It's a big step, but it's only one of the steps along the way. There are loads of other steps as well. And many trans people don't take that step for lots of very valid reasons, but they are just as valid as trans people as the trans people who do take that step. So, and the thing is, it's not of any consequence what's in anybody's pants to anybody else apart from the trans persons themselves and their sexual partner. That's it. It's not of consequence to anyone else at all. It's just a morbid curiosity, I think. So I think that's all it is. Yeah, so please don't judge people on how they look or how they sound. So as in my case, there can very often be a mismatch between how we look and how we sound, and so we don't fit the gender binary norms. And for non-binary people, they're never going to fit the gender binary norms just by their very definition. And so this is something that comes up a lot on the phone. So I'm very lucky that I very rarely get misgendered, face to face, but on but on the phone, I get misgendered all the time. I really do. But I can guarantee that I have never just cold called me, because when that happens, the phone just goes down. Yeah, so so that just happens. I don't know if you're having trouble. I'm just having a warning sign saying that there's trouble with the slow network connection, so I don't know if you can still see me and hear me okay. I hope you still can.
Hi, Kate. I can hear you. Okay, it's just catching up now.
You can, yeah. Oh, brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Rosie. Yeah, I was just having a bit of trouble there. And you may be in a position where you could offer style advice or makeup advice to trans people. And if it's offered in a friendly manner, then most trans people would gladly accept your help. And I've certainly been benefited from a lot of help from my cisgender female friends, and I'm very grateful to them for that. But just because you are cisgender, don't feel that you're entitled to criticize what a trans person wears or what they look like, because just as cisgender people come in all different shapes and sizes and styles, so do trans people when they're different in that regard at all. Okay, the old chestnut, toilets or bathrooms, depending on what you want to call them. Never force anyone to use a gendered bathroom that they're not comfortable with. Just accept that most people know the correct one to use. And the thing is, using public bathrooms is something that is a constant source of anxiety for many trans and non-binary people, because so many of them are abused. And it's not just trans and non-binary people. I've got lots of friends who are butch lesbians, and because they've got a more masculine appearance, they get a lot of abuse when they use public restrooms as well. So it's not just trans people. I've been very lucky. I haven't had any abuse in them, but I do alter my behavior when you use them. So I either don't speak or I speak very quietly, because I don't want my deep voice to cause make anybody else feel uneasy when they're using the bathrooms, and I don't want to be targeted for any abuse either. But it's crazy, because we've all got gender neutral bathrooms in our own homes, so why not have them in public? As long as the cubicle partitions and the doors go from floor to ceiling so that nobody can see over or under, and the lock works, then they're just a sealed room. So nobody's in any danger there at all. Cisgender people aren't at risk of being abused by trans people when they use the loo. We just want a wee in safety just as much as you do, and that's it. That's all there is to it. If you hear any transphobic remarks anywhere, and trans people that aren't there to defend themselves, then please step in and defend them. And this happened for me actually about a year and a half ago, just before lockdown, before we were all locked away in our homes and on Zoom and everything. I went to an event. Remember those things, events? I went to this event, and there were lots of people in the room. This is going to be such a novelty when we go back to those sort of things, I'll tell you. And I was told about a conversation between two men, And one of them pointed me out and said, see that person over there? That used to be Martin Neeves. I don't get it myself. And was talking about me quite disparagingly. But thankfully, the man that he was talking to had had the benefit of watching quite a lot of my vlogs, a lot of my videos. And so he'd been educated through those. And he said to them, said, well, actually, there's a lot more to it than that. And so he then went on to educate the other man. And I thought that was brilliant. That is what true allies do. It would have been so easy for him to have just done the polite thing and said nothing and just let it wash over. But he didn't. He did the hard thing, and he called it out, and he said, no, actually, no, that's not right. And he defended me, and I'll be forever grateful to him for that. I really will. I want to talk about employment very briefly here. There was a survey done recently that showed that transphobia in the UK in employers is rife, because 1 in 3 UK employers won't hire a trans person. Now, I'm surprised that that ratio isn't higher, to be honest, because most of my trans friends have struggled to get work, and usually it's because they don't get past the telephone interview because their voice doesn't match the expectation that the employer has got. But certainly for here in the UK, for people that for employers that do discriminate, they could land themselves in hot water, because gender reassignment is a protected characteristic of the Equality Act 2010. I'm not sure what it's like in other parts of the world, but that's what it's like here in the UK. But let's not look at or let's not dwell at on the negative side. Let's look at the positive reasons for employing trans people, because given the chance to succeed, most trans people will be so loyal and give 100% to their employer, because if you find a supportive employer, why would you want to leave and apply for a new job at a new company where you don't know what the culture is in the company? You don't know whether you're going to be discriminated against. You don't know whether you're going to get bullied. You don't know whether you're going to lose your job. You just don't know. It's a lot of worry involved in that. So if you've got a supportive employer, then you're going to stick with them, and you're going to be so loyal to them, and you'll probably be the best employee that employer's ever had. So I think that's a really good reason for employing trans people. Another survey showed that LGBT plus employees are 32% more productive when they're comfortable being out at work. Well, what's not to like about that? And I'm not surprised about that, because happy people do their best work. They really do. So just remember that trans people are just the same on the inside that they've always been, but far happier. The whole journey is just about realigning their bodies with who they really are to make them happy. That's what it's all about. So I'm assuming you're all there. I can't see any of you now. I've just been talking to my webcam for the last hour or so. So I'm assuming that you're all there, and I'm hoping that you're all fully signed up trans allies now. So yeah, thank you for that. And I can only educate a certain number of people. So what would really help me and my trans friends would be if you can just go away and tell at least one other person, more if possible, tell 5 if you can, but tell one other person just some of the things that you've learned today, and that would really help to spread the acceptance. So now I'm going to hand you over to Margot. So she's going to tell you about how to create safe and inclusive spaces within the workplace. So thanks very much.
Thank
Hey,
you.
thank you. Sorry, Rosie.
No, it's okay. I was just gonna say thank you so much, Katie, for sharing your story, and for just even that part about all the tips that you've shared, those practical tips that people can take away, is just so important to educate all of us and how we can be a trans ally. So really appreciate you coming on today. And yeah, and now we'll go on to Margot. I'll just share my screen, and let me know when I need to move forward on the slides, Margot.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Well, Katie, that was just really great, and I enjoy the story. I also felt for you. I felt the pain of some of those, and I think, if anything, you're very humble, and you're quite muted on some of the. I'm sure the challenges around the breakup of your marriage, and look, the relationship. I'm sure that the evolving relationship with your daughter and wider family, and having to sort of face all those challenges in your business are so difficult. I always think my journey has been hard, but it's never anything is hard, because I've had to sort of be open around my sexual orientation and that identity, but the rest has stayed pretty much the same. And I've always been in a situation where I could most of the time get away with, living my life as me and not always have to reveal, although that has changed over the years. But
Yeah.
but thank you so much, and I hope when I go through my slides that I pick up on some things that are hopefully helpful as well. I think most of them you've probably chatted about.
Yeah, brilliant.
Um, and I see my responsibility really is as an ally, as a sister in this space to help and support my trans brothers and sisters, and to be a voice when perhaps there isn't always a voice there as well. And in the spaces where somebody is saying something, to be the person who challenges that or tries to educate and help. I think the biggest challenge for probably most of us in the wider community, because it's in our own community and in life, is that we don't understand everything and we don't know everything. And that's why you telling your story is so important. Because I see, for instance, in the workplace, there are most people, the majority of people, as in most things, want to do the right thing, have the
Yeah,
right attitude, are caring, and are decent human beings. Their
I
biggest
totally.
challenges, yeah, their biggest challenge is a lack of knowledge,
Yeah,
and um, and they worry a lot about, what do I say, what do I call somebody.
I
And
do.
I'm usually kind of, and you can tell me if this is wrong as we go into the sessions afterwards, but I usually say, if somebody is coming forward as a woman, then the person's a woman, and you accept that as that as what it is. If somebody's a man, how
Agree.
somebody's addressing and coming to work or whatever that might be, is how they want to be accepted.
Yeah.
um,
So
and for me, that's kind of how I've dealt with that most of my life. I've just kind of said, if that's how somebody's coming across, then that's how it is. But people really struggle with that, and their fear of getting it wrong almost, it
yeah,
stymieses how they move forward. That's just been my
yeah.
experience, and I get people always asking me how.
Yeah, I often find that a lot of people are worried before they talk to me because yeah, they don't want to say the wrong thing, they don't want to upset me, and so I find myself putting them at their ease just to show them that just I'm an ordinary person, the same as you. Yeah, that's all it is. And I think that by telling my story, I think I can sort of illustrate that trans people are just ordinary people. That's it. We're not some sort of subspecies or something. That's all it is. You know, and just relax around it. That's all it is. But
Yeah, no, I
anyway,
agree. I agree. Sorry, Katie.
yeah, so I'll stop sharing my webcam now so that you can do your
Yeah,
presentation.
great. And listen, I won't be too long, and by
That's
all
fine.
means, come back in as well. And look, this is
Yeah,
very much kind of working
I'll
together.
I'll be back for the Q&A afterwards. So
Excellent, excellent.
thanks,
Well,
Margot.
look, thank you, Katie. Listen, everybody, I've got some slides which I wanted to talk about, creating a safe and inclusive workplace. Maybe just take a few moments as well prior to that to sort of tell my own personal story. Um, I'll certainly not make it too long, because today is very much about creating a safe place for our trans colleagues and friends. And I want to not detract from that. But a bit about me, I suppose. So, born in Ireland in the late, and I now, as I'm getting older, I start using the late more, the late 1960s. And I suppose grew up in a world where it was it's questioning your sexuality, your sexual orientation, was not something that I was expected to do. I was um, one of three children, the eldest of three, and it was all about sort of just getting on with life and moving forward. I really didn't have role models. I didn't know of anyone who was gay. I didn't know anyone who was a lesbian. And it wasn't until I was in school that I began perhaps maybe be a bit more aware. But even then, that was few. So I was big into tennis. So as I grew up, I was aware of Billie Jean and Martina, and maybe more on the fringes there. There was one or two people in music and drama, and I was an avid reader, so I began to seek out sort of information. But I didn't grow up in a world that had lots of people like me. I also I didn't grow up in a society. I grew up in rural County Limerick in Ireland, and I certainly didn't have much acceptance or a world where it felt safe for anyone to be different. And that was probably the very first lesson I learned as a young kid, because there was a man who was maybe a little older than me, and when I was a small kid, I learned that he had killed himself. And some of the reasons, or at least as I understood him at the time, were around the fact that he was gay. So that made me hugely fearful. And then growing up in the 80s and 90s, I went to school in the 80s, secondary school in the 80s, and starting out my college life in the 90s, it wasn't a safe or an encouraging space. And Ireland was extremely conservative and very narrow and very limited around being able to express yourself. So I basically was in the closet for most of that early part of my life. And I think where that changed and sort of became a little bit different was I went to London in about 1988. I didn't come out in London, funny enough, because I think I was still exploring all of this, but I was very clear that I was attracted to women. Um, and like you, Katie, that's never changed. That's always been there for me. I tried sort of to when I was younger have relationships with men. I had very nice relationships, but just didn't work for me. And I could never sort of put away from the back of my head about my attraction to women. I also, like Katie, a little bit when I was young, I was dressing up in clothes, and I think more sort of trying to find clothes that were more maybe more masculine. I was trying to get away from my mother putting my hair in curls and frilly dresses and pull away from this very feminine world that I was being driven into. And one of the things when I was in my early 20s was to just find myself with my clothes and just to feel comfortable with myself. And that was probably my biggest rebellion to start with. I did come out, I suppose, just very privately to friends in London and latterly in Dublin. And there was a bit of a struggle with that even in the beginning and starting work and finding a way. And I lived very much for a very long time, a very covered life where I was one thing with a small bunch of friends where I could be myself. And then something very different when I was in my workplace. So always sort of covering over about where I was going, who I was going with, what I did in my holidays. Um, really being very, very, it's a slightly move away from my mic, so I'll move the mic down there a little bit. Um, just not being honest, and really sort of, I suppose, bringing that story to a close. The big change for me was around workplace, and joining and getting involved in diversity and inclusion in my workplace was a big change maker for me, and I did that as a kind of advanced into the 90s. So I lived quite a lot of my life not being myself. And when I look back now, I think about probably just those lost opportunities to perhaps have a child. And I think, I was stymied a bit in my career progression. Not that anybody did something, but I had such a fear of being found out that it stopped me perhaps going further than I should have or pushing myself. However, I did get to be very lucky. I worked with Sodexo, and I've had a great, fantastic career. And I went on to become the CEO of the business in Ireland, and really have a very fulfilling career. I came out really publicly and worked through diversity and inclusion, and then I had the opportunity with the move for marriage equality in Ireland to support one of our NGOs, and again to be out publicly as a businesswoman who was supporting that business initiative around that. And I suppose that was the beginning of that journey. And one or two things I'd probably just, as I finish up now, would say that around that was probably the most liberating and the most fantastic thing, for me, because once you're free to be yourself, it is just fantastic. And that's made me feel very, very ambitious to do that for other people, to help people, to support people, to create that safe space for others. So, when you've touched and tasted freedom, then you want to make sure that everybody else has that. And I think that's been why I've ended up doing this work in diversity and inclusion, because I'm passionate about change and passionate about equality and equity and belonging, and every other word you can put on it, because for me it's just part and parcel of what we should do. And I think some of the challenges in the world are often, we're faced from our difference instead of the fact that so many of us are so alike. And, as Katie said, she's still inside the same person and experiences things in so many ways, but now she's free to be herself and to be joyful. And that really resonates for me. And maybe just another reflection, just particularly around my first exposure to trans people, and probably a little bit when I was a teenager, not perhaps understanding fully. And then I remember when I was, first out in the gay community in Dublin, um, going along to an event, and a lady called Lydia Fye came along, and my heart broke for Lydia at the time, because Lydia was one of the first people in certainly in the Republic of Ireland where I live, who was very visible in this space. And Lydia came along to an event one night that was for a group of lesbians, and people were not inclusive. And I remember a friend and I, in a couple of hours, came in and said to Lydia, "Do you want to come and sit with us?" And we didn't do it because we were great or better than anyone else. It was just human compassion and understanding that this was a fellow person who was needing to be included. And I think always that, I've always wanted to include people and just make people feel that they belong. So I think that was the start of something about understanding. And for me, right now, and ongoing in my life, I can't understand why we can't make these accommodations, why we can't create safe space, and we can't make it easy for our trans brothers and sisters. There's nothing different here, and all it just takes is opening up your mind and being aware, and being, I suppose, conscious about how you do that, and conscious inclusion. And that's an incredibly important part. And I'll conclude on my introduction to just say that I suppose in my own life, I've become very lucky. This has turned out to be the best thing that's happened for me. I'm now married 10 years to Sarah. I'm in speaking to you today from our sort of little box room in our apartment in Dublin. I'm incredibly lucky to be surrounded by friends and family, and lots of love and care and blessings in the world. And if we can do that and create that for everybody, then I think we're doing some really good work. So I just urge you all to think about that, and think about how you can create safe and inclusive workplaces and make people feel happy, because this is the happiness index, and it's really important to think about how we make people feel happy and included. So Rosie, if you don't mind just maybe putting up the first of my slides, that would be great. Or
Yeah.
I can open them myself and chat through them.
Sure thing. So as you can tell, I'm not super good with this
That's okay.
technology on GoToWebinar, but are you able to see the screen, Margot?
I can. It's a little bit small, so you probably need to open the second slide, and then if you can put it on PowerPoint on slideshow.
Is that okay?
Yeah. So go to the next one for me, please. Just click on one. Okay. I might open this myself just so I can have it so I can read it as well, a little bit bigger. Okay. So on the second slide, I've put it off I've kind of put the title of "Start Off with Intent." So how do we start to create that safe space? How do we create an inclusive space, a place that people feel they belong in? So I think you've got to start off with great intent, and then you begin to build on that and to continue that. So I've just kind of put a series of points here. I'll talk to them, some that Katie has spoken to, and then we'll come back with Katie and discuss these and take any questions. So first one is fostering a sense of belonging begins with building a culture that doesn't tolerate discrimination. So in all of our organizations, we have to be really clear we don't tolerate discrimination. So you stand up straight away and put your hand up for that. So stand up for what you believe in. We have to change the system from within. So we can't just bring sort of all outside actors, and it's got to be something we all identify with. I think it's important to be more intentionally inclusive. So don't just sort of think that just by feeling it that it'll happen. We have to intentionally make it happen so that people can feel that they can bring all of themselves to work. So that helps us to speak up, to be more creative. And I think, again, going back to some of the things Katie spoke about, looking at Katie's career in photography, you can be even more creative when you're happy and fulfilled in yourself. And to respect every trans person and their decision to be transgendered, and if they want to stay in the background and they're not ready to share that yet, to also make sure that we respect that privacy. Transphobia and discrimination is experienced in the workplace, so that is a fact, and it's very lived experience. So we need to build in checking systems, as we do with all aspects of diversity, inclusion, and health and safety, to make sure that we're developing and promoting all our LGBTQ plus individuals. So, that we're not just promoting those who are female or male. We also think deeper on that we think about people who are non-binary and all of our spectrum of folks. And when we think about talent and development, that we make sure that we think with that in our heads as well. Having policies that are consistent, and training and education. So going back to what I was chatting to Katie about, is a lot of people don't understand. They don't understand the languages, the language rather, and how we talk about these things. So making sure we're helping people and educating them and bringing them on their journey, and that for our folks that we affirm the benefits, and we demonstrate that we're committed to supporting transgendered team members. So it's not just something we are going to talk about, but there is actually policy, there's procedure, there's process. Be with your team members for all of their journey, and not just the transition, because that's incredibly important, but then somebody's got to come back into work. We've got a lifetime and maybe life stages. Somebody's having different things happen at different times. So not just for the short term, for the long term. Have a lot of allies. So, if you're building up a pride group or whatever, an affinity group, whatever you want to call that group, don't just leave it to them as well. Just make sure that it's wider and better. It's not fair for us in the community, or for Katie and her brothers and sisters, to have to be the ones that talk about this, and allow people to come and disclose as their personal choice and when they're ready. I think another thing to think about is to create policies that are inclusive people regardless of whether they're out or not. So, we have to think about creating the policies and ensure the policies are family friendly, and families thinking about the composition of families in different ways, because that engages wider thinking. Using gender inclusive language, and that's really a big issue right now in our workplaces. That, guys, is I'm not trying to be PC here, but truly it can stymize people. So we need to think about, how do we become more open about language? So team, everyone, folks, there is other words we can address everyone rather than just guys. Certainly as a woman, sometimes it can close you down, and if you've transitioned from that being male to female, I imagine that might be a challenge. And again, it's putting the othering out there. Um, Hopefully we can make the employee name change process as simple as possible. So let's make it complicated. Work with our HR, our people and culture teams, offering gender neutral bathrooms are just a few examples of changes we can make, and to make sure that we have that corporate support. Educational sessions we talked about, and it's often good to get outside professionals in to help with that, because so get someone like Katie to come in and help us do a session. Katie, I know I'm going to ask you, and I think I chatted to you about it, about you coming in and helping us at ISS in this. Beyond being specially trained in the skill, you've got a lot of sort of life experience can really help. And one of our in-house people might face harassment, so we're taking them out of that front line. Great opportunities for storytelling. So like we've just had this masterclass in storytelling from Katie, then it helps me with my empathy, and you and all of us in our awareness and support. Um, and there are many incremental steps that can be taken on somebody's journey, and no matter what their identity, and that's for all of us. We're not always ready to sort of just come out of the box and everything's perfect. There's our own journey as well. As a woman who has had a 30-40 year journey in this, there's still things that I really struggle with. And when I'm out and somebody thinks, occasionally it still happens that somebody asks me, if I'm married, and if I say yes, and then they say something about my husband, then I have to kind of go, oh, I have to tell this, and it's a challenge. I think there's a really big opportunity for those of us in the service industry, in the built environment, and in providing services, to look at the built environment, to look at buildings, and to challenge the system and the design, and to encourage inclusive designing of buildings. So again, do we incorporate those bathroom facilities? Do we really think about everybody who uses the building, and how it feels and how inclusive that is? And team leaders, encouraging them to be open and to be willing and to go a long way. And then the last one, so that was, I suppose, building with intent, and now to continue with intent. So keep engaging with your LGBTQ workforce. So if you've got a group, keep that engagement and make it cyclical, and talking constantly. Engage externally as well, because our learning is never stopping. And um, be advocates. So don't be afraid to be advocates. So whether that's a part of the world we're operating in, somebody, a supplier, something that's happening for us where we're not seeing the right kind of behaviors, we have to be advocates and stand up and speak out and speak truth to power. I think it's important to foster visibility. So, making sure that we see people who, advocate, and I guess who show the different elements of our blended families and of our rainbow families, to make sure that our leaders are visible. We wear perhaps lanyards, that we have now the very inclusive trans flag that's out there. You will see in my slides, this is something that our team in Finland, our ISS team in Finland, have in their backgrounds. And we use different ones in different countries. But again, incorporating the colors of the pride flag. And as you know now, that pride flag is evolving and changing. Identify and implement equitable and sustainable solutions. So think about, have we brought equity into everything we do? Explore our corporate support, and really try to expand it. So if we haven't got somebody who's trans in our workplace, and I'd find it strange to imagine, because I think most people and most companies do, but how are we supporting NGOs and those who are supporting others? So again, how are we using our money and our power and authority to help people? And I suppose shifting the way an organization operates isn't just beneficial for our employees, it also has implications for our customers, our consumers. Making assumptions about gender and sexual orientation play a large part in product development. So we think about product development. And there's been an amazing book written, I don't know if you've read it, Invisible Woman, about how buildings are built particularly for male bodies. So we need to think about that, and all the products that are designed for male bodies. So again, is there a better opportunity to market these things a little bit better? And having a rethinking on our view of gender may help a company serve better and reach our communities and our customers, and all of those who want to, from a social value, spend their money and engage in this way, and to be accepting and to show that in a very public way. And lastly, I'd make the point, it's always important for our leaders to set the tone and the stage for a truly authentic environment. So you will see at ISS, our CEO and our Chief People Officer really leading the way in this, and see that in so many organizations today. And that has to start, that tone from the top, and then take it the whole way through, and bottom up, so that this is something that's just very holistic, and happens very comfortably. So, Rosie, I think that was the last of my slides. I just want to say thank you for listening to me on those, and I'll try and stop my slideshow and get back to the webinar. Thank you.
Oh, that was brilliant. Thanks, Margot. That's some great tips there. So I think we're now on to the question and answer session. So if anybody's got any questions, this is your chance now. We will answer anything. We are at your disposal. Did you hear my cat then? My cat had a question.
Thank you so much for that, Margot.
No, you're very welcome. And I was just going to say, Katie, your expertise is deeper than mine. So, feel free to lead in most of these. And if I have something to add, I will, but, totally supportive.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Margot. So, right.
Yeah, and as Katie said, please feel free to throw any of your questions in the chat box. I did have a couple questions that came up before the webinar, so I'd just like to start off with one of them. We had somebody ask, why, so I'm sure people have seen on LinkedIn and Facebook and on Instagram now, you can add on your own pronouns. And so there was a question around whether even if you're not trans, why it's important to add in your pronouns onto your title, on your name, on those social media platforms, and even on email
Well,
footers.
yeah, that's easy. It just normalizes the use of them because it just shows that it's not just for freaks like me. It's for everybody. Yeah, that it's just, and I think because thing is that pronouns, they're not just for trans people anyway, because there are many people who have got names that aren't, you can't guess the gender. So people like Chris, Leslie, or someone's called Dr. Smith, for instance, you just wouldn't know what gender they are. So you just can't assume that. So why not just have it so that everybody uses them, and then it's just a normal thing. um yeah, that's all it is. I think it's just a case of, because we never have done in the past, and we've just sort of fumbled along as we have been, but there's a better way of doing it, and so it's much better to be able to do that. So yeah, that's what it is, just normalizing it.
And I probably just add to that. I think Katie, great explanation. I also think it's a missed opportunity if you don't, because again, we make assumptions. If you're in business, then you can really make the wrong assumption, and you can probably insult somebody if you get their name wrong. And maybe the third piece I'd add in is that if you continually don't call somebody by the right name, for me that's a form of harassment, and you probably leave yourself even legally open. So it actually makes good business sense, I think, these days as well. And
Absolutely.
our younger generation, I've got nieces and nephews who are in their teens, and they just assume that you kind of think this way. So I think the new generation coming into the workplace will expect us to have that kind of consideration.
Yeah, I think the new generation have got it, and they're great. I think it's sort of the sort of like our generation and older probably that are struggling with it. So
Mhm.
definitely the older
Definitely.
ones that need more education.
Yeah, definitely. I've had struggles introducing the concept to my grandparents. But we're working on it. I have another question that came in. So, what does it mean to you to be a woman by gender? I think you've kind of touched on this, Katie, in your presentation. But
Yeah, it's just, for me, there was always the sort of, it was like two people inside of me, and they were battling it out. Martin and Katie, they were sort of battling it out. Now there's no internal battle anymore. I'm just one person. I'm just me, and I'm Katie, and I'm really happy. And it what what it means to be recognised as a woman is just happiness. It's just contentment, and I'm blissfully happy. I couldn't be happier. So that's what it all is, purely about happiness.
love that. Thank you, Katie. Um,
See, I'm on brand as well for the happiness index, aren't I?
yeah, very on brand.
I got the
Um,
memo.
Any other questions are welcome. I wish I could see faces on this webinar. That's one thing I would change about this, is that we could do this in person, because especially at this topic and your stories that you've shared, would just be so much better to be able to be around and share the energy in person.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, they've been very quiet today, aren't they?
yeah. Okay, I've got some more. What
There you
sort
go.
of things should you include in diversity and inclusion policy? That's a
Well,
broad question, but take it away.
I think that's something that we can both contribute to, isn't it,
yeah,
Margot? Shall I sort of start off? Um,
please do.
So obviously we've already spoken about bathrooms. I think gender neutral bathrooms, I think, that instantly makes it more inclusive. So I think that's a good thing. Introducing the policy of using pronouns on all profiles and all the email signatures. I think that's really good. I think you need events. So it's events such as this for education. So a lot of education, but don't just have them within Pride networks or LGBTQIA plus networks. They should be, because generally the people that turn up are the people who are already supportive. It needs to be mainstream. It needs to go out to everyone, and it needs to be mandatory, to be honest, because so often if it's a voluntary thing, then only the people who are on side turn up, and you end up preaching to the converted, and you don't actually reach the people who need to be reached. So the people who really don't get it, they're the ones that you need to reach, and you can only do that if it's mandatory. So and for that you need backing from the top. So you've got to have it, so the CEO, right up from the C-suite downwards. If the people at the top have got it, then it will trickle down to the bottom, and then they should demonstrate how important it is. So yeah, that's really important. Do you want to do a few, Margot? Let's just see.
Yeah, I mean, I guess Katie's picked up the main things. I think first of all, it's making sure that when we think about our policies and procedures, and I'm thinking particularly really when you sort of take that cold HR sort of look at it, not that HR is cold, but that when you're looking at it from a point of view of policies and procedures, have you thought about all the different elements of things that happen for people in work? So we allow, for people for all sorts of aspects of their lives and change. So we've got policies around adoption, whatever, surrogacy, this, that, and the other. So have we thought about transition? So have we thought about transition from the very beginning? So when somebody is deciding this, that they first of all feel there's a really welcoming environment, that they can have that discussion, that we've perhaps maybe set up, because I think this is good practice. They've set up and we've identified people throughout the organization in our HR team, not just the Pride team, who are signaling that they are open to. So again, somebody feels they can go in and have that discussion. Then when somebody is transitioning, have we thought about it in our health insurance? Have we thought about it around all the benefits we offer? So if somebody is at an exec level and they have maybe perhaps health insurance tied in with the organization, have we thought about that with our insurer? Have we thought about what aftercare looks like? Have we thought about when somebody's coming back to the workplace? Have we thought then about, as a HR team, about how we do communications for somebody? So again, it shouldn't necessarily be up to the person who's transitioned to be the one to have to go and put the announcement up in the letter. And, so I'll give you an example that we've done in the past. In my former organization, and something I would certainly take forward, is that we as a HR team did an announcement. We were supportive. We put something out there with the agreement of the person. So never ever without, always, always together. But it made, for my colleague who was coming back to work as with a different identity and a new name on Monday, it meant that she didn't have to be the one that was having to do that. So it's that supportive way of doing it. And then, down the line, and Katie, you'll know more about this than me. I'm certainly not an expert, but, down the line from a point of view of official documentation, if somebody's traveling, even thinking about things like how do we assess somebody with global relocation, things that are happening in somebody's family life, big challenges perhaps as somebody's going through different life stages, maybe somebody's getting married, many other things happening, that as a HR team, just like we do with our heterosexual colleagues, or now our lesbian and gay male colleagues, that we also think about how do we include trans people with, and because there are different challenges, and particularly around passport recognition, etc. So again, how do we take that journey? So those are just some of the things I'm thinking about, Katie, that probably I would say.
Brilliant. If I just expand a little bit on some of what you've just said there. So I think the transition at work policy is essential. And so often I get contacted by companies where the trans employees come out to HR as being trans, and they just haven't got a policy in place. And there's just like this sharp intake of breath, and it's run away, what are we going to do? There's a trans person here, oh no. And they don't know what to do, and so they end up cobbling this thing together, and they're just being reactive. And it's so much better to be proactive, get it sorted in the first place, have your transition at work policy in place, but make sure that it's flexible, because remember that every transition is different, and every trans person is different, and they're going to feel differently about how they want to come out and when they want to come out. So it's got to be flexible. That's the first thing. And then records as well, your staff records, make sure that you can use preferred names, because so often, I mean, it takes time. Transition is a long process. It takes time, and people transition at their own pace, and they change their name legally at their own pace. So, for instance, I've got a trans employee, and she hasn't changed her name yet by default. So her legal name is still in her male name, and so for payroll purposes, and for the for all the legal stuff, the contract of employment and everything, that has to be in her old male name. But that's the only time I use it. I won't use it any other time. That is the only time I use it. The rest of the time, I use her preferred name. That it's just human decency to do that. And but companies have got to have the record system, the computer systems in place to support that. Otherwise, they could inadvertently out them. And that I mean, that's what happened with Primark, for instance. They got done for it. And they didn't do that, and they got done for it. And so there was yeah, there was a court case, and they lost it. So that's so that's one thing. And then also, Margot, you said about travel as well. Again, it's particularly difficult when trans people haven't yet changed their name legally, and they haven't got, so their appearance looks different to their passport, and the name's different and everything. And so that's a very, very difficult time. And then the other thing about travel is that, think about where you're sending them. Previously, when I was presenting as male, I could go pretty much anywhere in the world and be reasonably safe. Now, there are many, many places that I can't go in the world because I'd end up in prison or I'd end up being murdered. I can't go to those sort of places. And I mean, as a woman, there's less places that I can go than as a man, but as a trans woman, even less. So really think carefully about where you're sending staff, and do your research. It's a massive thing. It really is, and safety is crucial. And also, just don't think just about those locations. Just think about at the other end. When your employee comes out at the airport, where they've got to get to the airport, so they've got to get from the airport to their hotel. How are they going to do that? You can't use public transport. It's often very dangerous to use public transport, and even getting in a taxi can be really dangerous because you're getting into a car with a person that you don't know, and in so many countries that can be really dangerous. It's much better if you've got hotels that have got their own car service, because transport service, because that way they're much more accountable. So lots of things like that companies should be thinking about.
I think that's a great point, by the way, Katie, because as a lesbian, I worry about those things, and increasingly more so. Where do I go? Is it a country where legally I'm going to feel safe? Is it a country where, or is it a part of the world where, just prejudice is very high? Like if you think about some of the things that are happening in Eastern Europe now, and then I have to think about, not only as a woman, but as a lesbian woman, about my safety all of the time, from walking with, turning my head around, if I'm with my wife watching, is somebody watching us, the fact that people get off on trying to, have a sexual thing, whatever. So that's doubly hard, I imagine, in your scenario, because by the very physicality, somebody makes assumptions, or it's a really difficult one.
Yeah, you can't hide being trans. You could hide being lesbian or being gay. You
Yeah.
could hide that, but just by not holding hands or whatever. But being trans, you can't hide it. And I mean, I'm lucky that I'm only 5'7" and I've got a fairly slight build, so I'm lucky, and I'm lucky that I've got a heart-shaped face, so I don't feel the need for any facial feminization surgery. But in terms of my voice gives me away, and I, it is lighter than it used to be, but it's still got some way to go. But also the other thing is that I've relaxed a lot more about my voice, because I don't know if you're aware, with voice, when you go through hormone treatment for trans men, so female to male transitioners, when they go through hormone therapy, their voices drop naturally with the testosterone that they take, because their voices drop, their voices break. But obviously for trans women like me, we've already been through male puberty, and so our voices have already broken, and so once they're broken, you can't unbreak them. And so basically then so with the hormone treatment, that makes no difference to our voices. And so then we've got the choice of either voice coaching, or there is an operation where you can tighten the vocal cords. I'm not sure about that personally myself. I like singing, and they say that sometimes it can stop you being able to sing afterwards. And I think, well, I just wonder, So I haven't gone down that route. I have had a bit of voice coaching, but to be honest, I didn't, because I do so much public speaking. It's very hard. I can do a much more convincing, typically female voice, if I read a prepared passage, but being talking like this, where it's a spontaneous conversation, it's so much harder. And so I've relaxed a lot more about it. And I used to worry so much about how I sounded, but now I think, well, actually, my whole journey is about authenticity, and this is my authentic voice. So, people should just get over the fact that some women have deeper voices. Just get over it, So it doesn't bother me quite as much as it did. So yeah, so I think yeah, and of course, obviously, it's very difficult to hide that, and obviously, so the male frame doesn't change either. So for a lot of my friends, they're like 6-footers, so and they're built like rugby players, but they feel just as feminine as I do, and it's so much harder for them. It really is.
Well, I found the questions, and we've got quite a few that have come through now. So next question up that we'd like to ask is, I've noticed whilst reading articles online that some platforms use LGBT plus, others use LGBTQ plus. Is there a right and a wrong? And actually, I'm curious about this too, because I typically use LGBTQ plus.
It's grown, really, hasn't it? It used to be LGBT, and then, well, there used to be just LGB. That's another story. But it's grown. So I tend to use LGBTQIA plus, but there are lots of other letters, and it's, where does it stop? But I definitely like to use the I and the A there, because I think the I is important to recognise the fact there are very many intersex people. There's more intersex people around than there are trans people, so I think they shouldn't be ignored. And the A, asexual as well. I think there's very many of those, and I think they shouldn't be ignored. So I think it's important to recognise those. But it is a bit of a mouthful, and it does confuse people. I don't think there's any right or wrong. I don't think, as long as it's all used with good intentions, then it's fine. But Margot,
Yeah,
how do you feel?
yeah, I mean, very similar to you, Katie. I think it's an interesting one, Rosie, in that I was looking about this when I was resetting our strategy for D&I at ISS, and I spoke to some of my friends on the board of Out and Equal in the US, because they've most definitely, and our CEO there, they've explored so much of these topics and so many things. And the feedback was that we went with LGBTQ plus, and that the plus was inclusive of everything else, because the fear was that if we went on too much, people lose trying to even track what the other parts are. So I've tended to go into the LGBTQ plus. I find myself, sometimes I say LGBT, sometimes I forget the Q, sometimes I go LGBTQ. It depends, but that was what I got back as feedback, and so I've kind of reverted to that now, and working with it, and just for the sense of trying to have some ease and some middle ground. But I don't know that there's a right or wrong.
Well, thank you both. Okay, so the next question is, in a virtual world, what can we do in companies, especially to support LGBTQ plus and trans colleagues? Yeah, over to you.
Okay, yeah, particularly in a virtual world, I just think the same as you in the real world. So the only thing is that many trans people can feel very isolated. I think a lot of people, cisgender people, felt very isolated over the last year and a half with lockdown and everything. But trans people, particularly many trans people, are so worried. A lot of them are very insular, and they're very worried about even just stepping outside their front door. And so it is just a case of just giving them the support that they need. Because everyone's different, everyone's going to need different support. But just being there for them and just having those policies in place is exactly the same, whether it's virtually or whether it's in person. yeah, I don't know if there's anything that you can think of that's specific to virtually, Margot.
I think the thing with virtual is that we're inclusive when we use these tools, and that we think about, so like it's Pride Month at the moment. I think most organizations are using the Pride flag besides signatures. We might have it on. I can't use it in this format, or at least I don't know how, because I'm not technically very good, but I've had it in my background in most of my company Teams calls, that sort of thing. I mean, I think everything comes back to visibility, and it becomes even more important at a time like this, when we're in this virtual world. Because if I'm feeling lonely and on my own, then the visibility of a leader wearing a lanyard, or seeing the pride colors somewhere, or seeing it on someone's signature, means a heck of a lot to me. Um, if I'm feeling low or whatever, that's a pick me up as far as I'm concerned. And then I think, being conscious, as we always do, that we use everything that these tools have. And again, I'm not an IT person, so but just like we might for the deaf community think about captions, or we might think if someone has a visibility issue, we might think about how we include how things are written, etc. That we just think, is there a way, is there something we do? And perhaps the last part I would talk to is that we use language that's inclusive. So again, if Katie's on this call with me, I'm conscious about thinking, how do I make sure, that I'm using Katie's pronouns properly, and that I would probably check beforehand. And Katie, just goes to show, we chatted 2 or 3 months back, or 2 months back, did I have to ask myself, did I check with you what pronouns you like to use? So, it's that whole sense of constantly
Yeah.
having that conversation.
I don't know if you needed to, because we have exchanged emails and it's on the
Yeah,
bottom of the email signature, so we probably didn't need to. So I think that's probably
yeah.
all that. But
But
yeah, I
but
think
it's an
yeah,
example of
mm,
just thinking about inclusion. Do I
yeah,
think about someone's pronouns? Do I think
mm,
about how they like to be addressed? Maybe there's something for somebody that they're not comfortable. I mean, even down to the fact that in this virtual world, we've all been in our living rooms, or like me in this small box room. So, I have almost a sign on the outside of the door, don't come in, I'm on a live feed, so, but not everybody is in that situation. They may have to be share their apartment with somebody who maybe isn't comfortable to be out also. And so have we thought about that when we're doing something? I think it's slightly deeper than we think, and we have to check that.
mm. And I think when you're sort of saying about when you see a leader wearing a pride lanyard or anything, it does mean a lot, doesn't it? It
Oh,
just sends
big
out a
time.
very strong signal. And I,
Definitely.
I love it when somebody sends me an email, and on their email signature at the bottom it says I'm an LGBTQIA plus ally or something like that. And I think it's great. And I always comment about it and I always say thank you for being an ally, because
Yeah.
we can't do this on our own. We need our allies. Allies are so important. They really
Mhm.
are. And for people just showing that, and just wearing a rainbow lanyard or something, just to show that they are supported, does make a difference, definitely.
Big time. And, they're not going to lose anything by it. And if they
No,
do, the people who are going to have a problem about that are probably not the kind of people they want to associate, most people.
exactly.
So I think it's such a plus, be
Mm,
visible.
definitely.
Thank you both. So I'm sorry, I'm feel like I'm hammering away at questions here. We've got a lot that have come through, and we've only got 15 minutes left. So the next question up was, um, in your experience, do you think things are improving for trans people?
Okay, two answers to this. Yes, in terms of general public out and about, yeah, I've found that I've been very well accepted. Generally, most people are absolutely fine. But there are certain worrying areas. So there's a certain group of people who are very anti-trans and are very transphobic, and they are very well funded and they're very well organised, and they've infiltrated all the certainly all the UK major political parties, and there's all over the world that is happening, and they're trying to change policy from within. And so there's a lot of laws now that are being made that are coming in that are taking trans rights away. And so there's big fights, and we've had huge fights on hands just to try and hold on to the limited rights that we have got. So politically, it's got worse, definitely. but also in the media as well. The media is generally very anti-trans. There's one or two exceptions that are good, but generally it's very anti-trans, and so they tend to amplify the anti-trans stories. And then when you get a positive trans story, they don't want to know. So that's happening, and then social media as well. I think they have a lot to answer to. There's so much hate that is whipped up on the social media platforms, and so many trans people, they think that what they see on social media reflects what happens in real life, but it's not. It's not. Real life is so much nicer than that. But that's what they see, and then it frightens. That's why they're frightened to go out the front door, because they see all this on social media. And the thing is, these social media platforms, because you don't have to give your any form of identity and identification when you open these accounts, they allow anonymity, and so they allow people to have their fake names in their avatars, and then they can say whatever they like, and they say all sorts of vile stuff. I mean, I get a lot of hate mail, and a lot of hate messages, and I had over 1,000 messages of abuse recently. But I realise that it's part of the job, because I stick my head well and truly above the parapet. It shouldn't be part of the job, but it is. I think Twitter is okay. Is a bit of a cesspit, but it is. They've cleaned up their act a lot in terms of if there is an abusive message, if you complain about it, my experience is that they deal with it within 24 hours. They're very good, and LinkedIn as well, particularly. They did one recently. I was very impressed with their response. Facebook and Instagram, however, different story. They're terrible. They make it so difficult. I mean, with that 1,000 messages of hate that I had recently, that was mainly on my Facebook, Call to Be Trans Facebook page. Do you know how many clicks it takes to report a post, delete it, and block someone? It takes 16 clicks. I had to do that for 1,000 messages, and then there wasn't any point in reporting them, because they didn't do anything about it anyway. They just don't want to know. They really need to clean up their act. Facebook and Instagram. Well, Instagram is the same company. It's all run by Facebook, so they really do need to sort it out. I mean, if LinkedIn and Twitter can do it, so can Facebook. But the will obviously isn't there. They obviously like people having arguments on their platform, because it generates more ad revenue. I'll get off my high horse now.
No, listen, I'm not going to sort of, I think Katie's brought it up. I think, I'm not trans, so I don't have the same experiences as Katie, but I am somebody who's observing and watching this. And, very sad even to see something coming up today in Hungary, a new law being passed around education, etc. I'm very sad to see that a world I thought was getting better in even 3, 4 years ago seems to be going the other way. The amount of trans women and men, but maybe more even women, who are killed every day. And if you go to South America, the numbers are astounding.
It feels worse, isn't
And
it?
yeah, it is getting worse. And I agree. The alliance, and some of the vitriol that's coming out there, is really just shocking. And I was shocked to see that this would even happen. To be honest with you, maybe I'm naive and innocent, but yeah. So I think that it's certainly not a safe world, and things are perhaps in many ways going down. But yet, then social acceptance among friends and family and people I know, and just maybe it's my insular world. I don't see people I know are all very comfortable and very accepting, and I'm talking about towards trans colleagues and friends, but it's the wider world, and politics is going more right wing, and it's frightening. And I think that there's no doubt that the ascent of Putin in the last couple of years, Trump and etc., when they've spewed out their hate-filled speech, it's encouraged and allowed the world to be more comfortable to do that, and that's pretty terrible.
There's so many states, in the US now that are bringing all these anti-trans laws, and it's horrendous what's happening. Terrible.
And it goes back to what you said, Margot, about that leadership piece. When you have a leader who is an ally, then that is fostering that safe space. But when they're opposing that, then obviously it's going to be scary for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Moving on to the next question. we're going to be designing, this is a bit of a flipping the script now. We're going to be designing a new office space soon. We're only a small company, 75 people. What are your tips for making our space more inclusive?
Okay. Well, I think we've already covered it, obviously, with bathrooms. I think gender neutral. That in terms of the space, that makes that easier. In terms of physical office space, I'm trying to think if there's anything else that would make it. Can you think of anything in terms of the physical office space, Margot?
Well, I think
I'm sure.
it's that design for inclusion. So, even it's not, this isn't a trans thing, this is just full stop,
No.
that we design and make sure that the building is accessible. So,
Yeah.
terrible thing to say, but you see organizations still having buildings with stairs and no lift. Um, um, and that the building is, by its very nature of how signage and everything is done, is that
Mm,
it's inclusive of everybody. So we
yeah.
don't use, for instance, again, it goes back to bathrooms. Do we get a building that just has a male and a female, gents and ladies? You know, do we push the boat out and push for a little bit further? And that we, as much as possible, and listen, sometimes budget doesn't allow for it, but if we can have a space that is going to allow as many people to come in, be there, and to enjoy a working life that is fully open, then that's the best kind of space. So inclusive design is important, I think.
Great, thank you both. And this is the last question I'm going to end on for today. There's actually two of them that are kind of centered around this, so it's a good one to end on. What is your hope for the next generation, and what is one piece of advice you would give parents when discussing this topic with children?
Right. Well, my hopes for the next generation is that there won't be a need for people like me doing what I'm doing. Put myself out of a job. It'd be great if there wouldn't be a need to have discussions about this, because it would just be not a thing. It would just be accepted. We're all just people, and our differences would be celebrated. And I think, yeah, it would be just great to be able to live in a world that, differences wouldn't be an issue. We're just people. So I think that's the hope. And so, oh yeah, and you want to know what about advice for parents talking to children about it. Just be open and honest about it. Kids are great. Kids aren't born with prejudice; they're taught it. I'll give you an example. So my daughter, so it's obviously before lockdown. I took her to a soft play area, and we were in the soft play area, and I was just having a coffee, and then she went in to have a play in there. And she still calls me dad, and I'm happy for her to call me dad, because I'm proud to be a dad, and I love her calling me dad. But the only problem is when she calls me dad in public, that outs me. So I'm trying to get to the stage where she calls me dad in private and Katie in public, but she's not quite there yet. It's
Yeah.
sometimes she gets it, sometimes she doesn't. But at that point, she just hadn't got it at all. And so she went in there and she was playing. And then after a while, she came and she said, "Oh, Dad, can you come in and play with me?" So I said, "Yeah, no problem." So I took my shoes off, went in there and played with her. Of course, it wasn't long before she called me dad. And these other kids heard that, and then there's one little boy. He's put his hands on his hips and his head on one side. He said, "So are you her mum or her dad?" So I said, "I'm her dad, but I'm transgender. That's why I look like this." And it's like, oh, and it was like bees around a honeypot. They were all around me. And so then I found myself doing this impromptu trans awareness training session using age appropriate language in a soft play area. But once I told them, they said, "Oh, okay," and they just carried on playing. You don't need to cushion kids from it. You can tell them exactly how it is. That they're fine. They are fine with it. They really are. And afterwards, I thought, I better just go and tell their mums just so that they know what's gone on. So I went and told them, and they were fine. I mean, it could have gone either way, I suppose, but they were actually fine, and we had a lovely conversation. But no, just be honest with the kids, and obviously just use age appropriate language. There are lots of books out there. There's things like for younger kids. There's one called Vincent the Vixen, which is really good. Which explains just the basics, but just for primary school kids, it just gets the idea that we're all different. So yeah, there's lots of ways of doing it.
Yeah, and I guess for me, it's a slightly different example, but it kind of picks up what Katie's saying. And sorry, it sounds long-winded, but my mum, who's died a couple of years ago, just 2 years ago, had Parkinson's, and when I would take her out before she got really ill, she had tremors and she'd quite bad dyskinesia, and people used to think she was drunk because she was shaking and all over the place, and I suppose we make awful assumptions in life about things. And, my hope for the world is that we get better about drawing in, considering, evaluating before we make judgments, and just taking a breath before we make judgments on people. So I think that's a great story, by the way, Katie, about your daughter, you know, but also then we have to have the dignity to help to explain to people and take them, and I love that you didn't make it complicated. You don't, you did a really lovely, I think I really hold that explanation very close. I have great hope for the majority of the next generation. I think, and even for me at 50 something, it's a couple of generations down now, but certainly our young people and our people who are coming from teens into their early 20s, I think they're great. And the ones who go out in the world and, throw bottles at people because of their religion, their sexual orientation, or whatever it might be, them I fear for, because I think there's something, they have a need in them, and I hope that that gets met for them. Um, but for those who are very accepting and warm, that's wonderful. But our journey now is to help educate and challenge, and to never be afraid to try to bring someone from not understanding to understanding. But I'm hopeful, and I think the world is a good place. And there's always, it's usually a, a 90-10 or an 80-20. The majority of people are good young people, and I think they'll make for better world citizens. They're certainly more aware than the ones who went before. Look at where we are right now, and a lot of us came from a climate of much hate and discrimination. So if we can eliminate a lot of that, we're going to have a better world, hopefully.
Absolutely.
I think that, having you two on, especially today, sharing your stories and having these conversations is just another step towards making more inclusive and safe spaces. And I just can't thank you both enough for coming on today and being so open and honest with us. Yeah, and thank you to everybody who's joined. I'm sorry we couldn't get through all the questions today. Yeah, I guess that was it for me. And I guess we're nearing up to the 1 o'clock point. So yeah, thank you both.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks very much, Rosie. And lovely working with you, Margot, as well. And thanks everyone
And
for
same
watching.
likewise. Ladies,
And if people want to get in touch with you both, sorry, and one last thing, if people want to get in touch with you both, how can they reach out to you? LinkedIn? Is that a website?
I don't know if you can see there's a Linktree link there.
Perfect. Yep.
But if not, just onto my website, cooltobetrans.co.uk, or at cooltobetrans on lots of the, Twitter and all that sort of stuff. I'm on all the social media. I'm all over it like a rash.
Perfect.
And LinkedIn, although I'm not always the best to get it, because there's to get around to doing everything, but I will try to get back to somebody if I can. And look, always through yourselves. And thank you for sharing with us today. And Katie, really, tremendous. And I feel honoured and privileged to have shared and heard your story. And look forward to talking again soon. And Rosie, well done. Great, you're a star at all of this.
You two are the stars of the show. All right. Well, thank you both. We'll see you again soon.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.